Well, welcome everyone to the official launch of a new report that sheds light on the current state of the media industry. I'm Sharanjit Leyl, and it's a real pleasure to present the new Sustainability Investing in the Future of Asia Pacific's Info Ecosystem report. It was commissioned by the Society of Publishers in Asia, or SOPA, supported by the Google News Initiative, and prepared by Economist Impact. Now, the goal of this launch is to provide all of you joining us today with crucial insights into the report. We'll hear from the chair of SOPA and senior leaders from the Google News Initiative and Economist Impact. And this is going to be followed by a panel discussion with key industry leaders who will discuss the direction the news industry is heading in. And of course, we'd love to hear from all of you. So please start thinking of questions, and you can ask them in the Q&A chat box, and I will get to them at the end of our discussion. Well, without any further ado, I'd like now to introduce the chairman of SOPA, Byron Perry.
Hello, everyone. I am Byron Perry, the chair of the Society of Publishers in Asia and the founder and CEO of Coconuts Media. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about SOPA, the Society of Publishers in Asia. So we are a Hong Kong-based not-for-profit organization. We were founded 40 years ago. It's actually our 40th anniversary in 1982 with the objective of championing championing freedom of the press and promoting the growth of the media industry. Our main activities include putting on the SOPA Awards each year, which are our flagship journalism awards for editorial excellence, and publishing statements on free press across the Asia Pacific region. Our members include the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Bloomberg, Reuters, Financial Times, South China Morning Post, Channel News Asia, Philippine Daily Inquirer, Vogue Hong Kong, and Coconuts Media, which I founded and run. A bit on Coconuts, we are an alternative media company reaching an audience of millions across Asia with fresh and juicy news and documentary videos. So about this survey, we partnered with the Google News Initiative and Economist Impact to basically survey 12 markets across the Asia Pacific region, both consumers and executives, and see what is going on with the media industry and generate some data there. It's the first of its kind, and it's a very broad survey. Again, 12 markets were covered. It's more broad than it is in depth, but we like to think that we generated some really useful insights into the future of the media industry, what's working and what's not. And our aim, again, also is to spur conversations about sustainability, investment, and how we can improve the media industry. So some key findings that I would like to share. First of all, 82% of executive respondents were bullish on the media industry. 82% said that they believe profits would be sustainable. So that was a great insight that we thought was kind of contradictory to what we've seen in a lot of other surveys and reports on the media industry. Here in the Asia Pacific region, at least in terms of executives, again, both in the media industry and in other industries, folks felt that the outlook was bullish. In terms of the consumers, a great finding that we had was that 82% said that they believe news is essential for a functioning society. But there was a bit of a disconnect in that 60% nearly of consumers don't pay for news. So they understand that it's very, very important to a functioning society, but most do not pay for it. So that was an interesting insight. Furthermore, the digital disruption that has been happening and is very well covered over the last few decades was just kicked into hyperdrive by the pandemic. And so we found that 18 to 24-year-olds are twice as likely to access news through social media, mobile alerts, rather than traditional forums. And so that movement to the digital sphere is happening at an even faster rate these days. Lastly, in terms of misinformation, everyone agreed that it's a major problem. And in terms of consumers, I think that's where we saw the most interesting responses. 47% of consumers, nearly half, said that they had actually lost money. They had had a financial loss due to misinformation. And 76% said that they worry about misinformation a lot. So misinformation is a problem that really a lot of different spheres are responsible for it and need to help improve it, both the media industry, tech platforms, and governments and consumers. But I think one thing we found is that people are definitely very clear that it's a major problem that they think about and worry about a lot. So I'm really excited to present this survey to you. Naka Kondo from the Economist Impact is going to go more in depth. I want to thank the Economist Impact for performing the survey. I want to thank the Google News Initiative for sponsoring the survey. And without further ado, let's move forward and learn more about this report.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Byron, and really fascinating to hear about some of those insights in the report, which we'll continue to hear about in depth as we go through this. Now, next with her welcoming address is Irene J. Liu, News Lab lead for Asia Pacific for Google.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to start by saying thank you to Byron for your leadership in SOPA and for introducing this idea of wanting to do this research, which we think is so important. And also to thank Naka and the entire Economist team for the amazing work that they've done. And lastly, to thank all of you who are joining to hear the results, and our wonderful panelists who are going to provide their insights. As Byron mentioned, the Google News Initiative, we supported this research because we believe that it's really important to understand more about how the Asia Pacific region is changing. We are constantly telling our colleagues around the world that there are amazing things that are happening in APAC. And it's just wonderful to be able to really have the Economist to provide their rigor and research chops to, really shedding light on the current and future state of news and information here in this region. We are really, really heartened to see that among senior figures within the news industry in this region, that there is optimism about the future of news publishing in APAC. And also an acknowledgement that in order to sustain and to have that long-term success, that digital transformation is critical, and adapting business models to become more diverse and digital focused is really key. Those are things that we have seen in our work with news partners around the region, and we are now and continue to be really, really focused on supporting the goals of news publishers to help strengthen quality journalism. We've also seen firsthand that innovation is taking place in order to explore new business models and also find new ways to connect with audiences. Some of our amazing panelists have been doing just that. So, really excited to hear more about how that's been working on the ground with their own businesses. We know that technology has a critical role to play here, and we want to do our part, and we are excited to hear more from the Economist team about what their findings were in that research. Again, keeping it short, thank you again to everyone who pulled this work together. And a special thanks to our panelists for really taking time out of their busy schedules to join the discussion. And with that, I will hand it back to the Economist team to get to the meat of it, the report. Thank you all.
Thanks for that, Irene, and thanks also for underscoring the incredible role that technology and digital transformation plays in the news industry today. And as Irene mentioned, yes, next we can go into the details of this report. And I can introduce Naka Kondo, who's the manager for policy and insights at Economist Impact. Naka, over to you.
Thank you, Sharanjit. Thank you, Byron, and thank you, Irene. I'm Naka Kondo from Economist Impact, and I would like to delve right into what we found in this report. News sustainability, investing in the future of Asia Pacific's info ecosystem. If we could turn the page, please. We set out to ask, what can news media executives do to secure the future of the news media industry and the vital information it publishes in Asia Pacific? So Economist Impact surveyed over 2,000 consumers and 500 executives across 12 Asia Pacific markets. And in the survey, we found if we could switch to the next page, please. Yes. And today I'd like to share some key takeaways from our findings. Yes, the news media landscape has been disrupted, but despite this dynamic landscape, executives were very bullish, as were the experts we've spoken to. One thing that came up was technology is key to the future sustainability of the industry. The immediate challenges people suffered were that, yes, quality news is valued very highly by both consumers and executives, but that is not somehow efficiently translating into the bottom lines of many media companies. One other issue that came up was misinformation. So with the advent of things like social media, the impact of misinformation has been amplified, and that is front and center of many people's minds, both consumers and executives. And media companies would need to address this going forward. And in the end, I think all experts unanimously agreed that media companies do need to start thinking very creatively, but the future is bright for them. So if we could turn the page, please. Yes, so digitization and its acceleration due to the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed the news media landscape. The way news is researched, produced, and shared has changed entirely as is consumer behavior. So if we look at people aged 18 to 24, these people are twice as likely to access news via TikTok, social media, and news aggregators, which means that these people do not necessarily associate specific articles with the specific media brand or the company that is writing these articles. They just consume them in a completely different way that we have traditionally used to consume news. And so it's this from these stats, it's clear that to be sustainable in the future, news media companies in the APAC region must find new ways of operating. If we could turn to the next slide, please. But despite this, executives were very bullish on the outlook of this industry. As you can see, 82% of executives in Asia Pacific agree that profitability in the news media industry is healthy and sustainable. And in fact, if we looked at the media and publishing executives only, we found that even a higher number, 88% of executives agree to the same statement. To the next page, please. So 83% of news media industry executives expect healthy demand growth in the next year. What's interesting, though, is that simultaneously, little over a half, 53%, recognize the organization's current business model will not be viable in the next 5 years. And 62%, a slightly even higher number of that, believe one's organization is underinvested in digital strategies over the past 5 years. So we found that through the pandemic, there was a recognition on both sides, consumers, executives, and the media companies themselves, of the importance of quality news, which is good news for the industry. But at this very moment, I think people, executives in the media industry, recognize that they're not where they should be in terms of digital and technology investments and the business models that they're currently working with. But they are confident that they will get there. The next page, please. So technology definitely is the key to growth. This is been identified by experts and the executives that we've surveyed, and Ritu, who is on the panel today, has said technology is a critical pillar of news media companies today. To the next page, please. So when we addressed the executives on the importance of technology, an overarching number of people have recognized technology as an enabler rather than a disruptor. Yes, there are some disrupting aspects of technology, but the key to winning and to the sustainability of this industry is to embrace the enabling aspects of technology. And as you can see here, 87% of executives have said digital technologies helped increase the profitability of news media companies. 83% have said technology has helped the news media industry create more jobs. And an equal number have also said The news media industry is innovative. This is also very interesting. Some of the experts we've spoken to, these people have thought that the newspaper industry is really old school, very hard to change, but the pandemic changed everything. They saw changes happen. And I think at this moment in time, people are much more confident and in fact encouraged that this industry can actually change. To the next page, please. I spoke to Hiromi Onishi, the Chief Technology Officer of the Asahi Shimbun, and she said something very interesting. The improvement in the quality of digital translation has proved exponentially of late. And so theoretically in that world, local media companies of today will potentially become global media companies. They're able to address the entire world in their local language, thanks to technologies like this. So there are new opportunities with technology, and something like this is very an interesting example that we came across. To the next page, please. Now, we have found that executives and consumers really rely on news and information and quality news and information to make daily decisions, and they see a great value to its role to societies and economies. Consumer respondents, 82% agree that access to news and information is important to society's overall functioning. On a personal level, 60% said they depend on published news to help them make personal or financial decisions. Executives, even a higher number of executives, believe that access to news and information is important for society's overall functioning and for society's economic activity. And they also believe 84% have said jobs created by the news industry represent a significant part of the economy. However, the subscription levels do not reflect this value. If we could switch to the next page, please. So Mr. Hiraguri is the director of the Digital Growth Operations Center at the Asahi Shimbun. He said, the problem today is that quality news is not tied to the action of payment. And this is something that we did find through our surveys. If we could turn to the next page, please. So in fact, 58.7% of the consumers we have surveyed have said, I do not have any paid subscriptions to any magazines, newspapers, or news services today. On the flip side, though, 41% have said, I have one or more. An interesting finding is that recently, many more media companies in Asia have started to put up paywalls, whereas before they hadn't. So that 41% do have a paid subscription to some form, not just English, it could be a local language. This is not a bad number. And it does actually bode well for the news industry in Asia Pacific. If we could go to the next page, please. Another thing we found through the research was misinformation and the issue of misinformation. Now, misinformation is nothing new. It has always existed in society, but the advent of social media has amplified the impact, I would say, of misinformation. And this is at the front and center of both executives and consumers. So you can see here, 82% of executives have said, I am concerned about the impact that growing misinformation could have on my country's economy. 81%, misinformation is a significant threat to the long-term sustainability of the news media industry. More than, well, I guess for consumers, you can see 78% have said, governments have a duty to curtail the spread of misinformation. 76% have said, I worry a lot about misinformation. So this is very personal, and media companies would need to be cognizant of this and to address this going forward. If we could turn to the next page, please. So Sasha has said, misinformation goes far beyond media. It attaches itself to the fabric of society and democracy itself. I'm afraid the problem is just going to get bigger with deep fakes. If we could turn to the next page, please. Of course, going forward, we really need to think about how media companies could be more sustainable. And of course, rethinking business models came up as one big theme. And through the survey, we found that there, as you can see, 54.2% have said new revenue sources or business models beyond ads and or subscriptions, but almost an equal number, close to 50%, 45.6% have said we should really intensify efforts to expand its sales or subscriptions, i.e. to kind of prolong and promote some of the traditional things or traditional ways media companies have been making money. But interestingly, the media experts we've spoken to unanimously said, we need to think creatively about branching out into perhaps non-traditional forms of business models for media companies. If we could turn to the next page, please. So Alan Soon from Splice said, every single player in this space must be able to work across multiple revenue lines, whether that's subscriptions, memberships, events, consulting, and understand all of those. If we could also turn to the next page, please. Oliver from PwC Singapore have said, news media companies need to focus on monetizing those eyeballs that they attract through content, linking it to e-commerce. I think will be the key thing that is underexplored in Asia Pacific so far. Now, this is the methodology of the survey. I just wanted to share this with you. 500 responses from the 12 Asia Pacific countries, the ASEAN, Australia, Hong Kong, India, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. And we made sure that the survey included 30% each from media and publishing, government, NGOs, and a range of other corporates. For the consumer survey, the geographical, the region remained the same. We surveyed in the same regions as we had done for the executive survey. We made sure that there was a good balance of the gender and I guess the cohorts of the age. And these surveys were both conducted in the 3 months starting from December of 2021, and we concluded the survey in February of 2022. Now, lastly, but of course not the least, if we could go to the final slide, please. I would like to thank all of the experts that have contributed to the paper. And Alan Soon, Damien Cave, Sasha Buchanek, Ross Settles, Hiromi Onishi, Daichi Hiraguri, Oliver Wilkinson, and Ritu Kapur. And we have 2 of the experts also joining us today for the panel. Thank you. That was my time. And back to you, Sharanjit.
Thanks so much for that, Naka, and really some fascinating insights, as you say. And of course, I'm sure all of you listening must be struck by some of those statistics. So please do keep your questions coming. You can put them in the Q&A chat box, and I will get to the end, get to those questions after we speak to these expert panelists that we have right now. So let's go to them. And we're joined by Joey Chung, the CEO and co-founder of the News Lens, Ritu Kapur, co-founder and managing director from the Quint, and Ross Settles, the adjunct professor for journalism and media studies at the University of Hong Kong. A warm welcome to you all, and thank you for making time for us today. Now, as mentioned, 2 of you contributed to this report. So I guess as a way to start off for all of you, what do you make of the report? I mean, really some surprising statistics. 82% of folks out there who were surveyed are bullish about the industry. So what do you make of the conclusions? Does anything surprise you? Ritu, do you want to kick off?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I think the sentiment that's contributing to the 82% bullishness is I think in contrast to the really difficult period we all went through during the pandemic. And I think to begin with, we saw a definitive shift of ad dollars towards digital news. I think whether this bullish sentiment is actually going to play out, I think this, from where I am, I think this is the critical year, which is the first really, in a sense, the pandemic agnostic year as far as the markets and news and consumer sentiment is concerned. So I really think we'll know how this is playing out by, say, the third quarter of this year. What I think we're also grappling with, which may not have been the case at the time of the survey, is people returning back to work and therefore a drop in consumption of news online. Now, where that is going to balance out, we'll really know again as this year proceeds, because I think a lot of people are coming back to work. A lot of people are trying to reestablish their businesses. I think there's a lot of distraction, which may be taking away from news. I think the other thing that that came out also in the Reuters digital report is the huge concern that we're now dealing with is news avoidance. And I think we'll need a lot of innovation and communication to get people to understand why news is more important today than ever before. And I think we tend to be sort of news people, getting the stories. We sometimes do not think enough about what we're communicating to the audience. And from where I am, I think it's also very important to now tell consumers of news what goes into news consumption, news creation, what goes into, where journalists put themselves out there, sometimes their health, and in countries like ours, even their lives at risk, and why that deserves reader revenue to support news media. And I think that communication we haven't done enough of. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Yes, some great thoughts there, Ritu, and certainly, again, it underscores how important the industry is and the crucial challenges out there for the need to survive. Joey, what's your perspective? Were you surprised by some of the conclusions of this report?
I think all in all, not too surprising. I think it does kind of reflect the past couple of years in terms of the sentiments. I think to mirror the last comment, I think it's because maybe when we attended these panels 4 or 5 years ago, it seemed the overall sentiment was rock bottom. Media companies are going to go bankrupt. It's hard to see what's going to happen. There's just too many things going on. I think the good and bad, but I guess an opportunity because of the pandemic was it did force everyone to focus. It did force us to quickly transition to fully digital, to all the initiatives that we were talking about over the past few years. And so I think it offered clarity, which is why I think now that the pandemic is going in its third year, people feel like maybe we're used to this by now. It doesn't necessarily mean that the overall situation is better, but it just means we know what needs to happen. We're kind of used to all the pressures, everything that used to shock us and depress us 5 or 6 years ago. It's going to be here in the long term, and we know what we need to do, at least step by step. We're not so shocked or not so surprised. Just to give a few personal examples, when the pandemic started, 6 months, a year into it, one of the most common conversations I would have would be any business meeting that we would have. People would say, "Oh, I'm sure the pandemic is great for the media business digitally." 90% of anyone on the street would say that to me. They would think pandemic is great for digital news, which is a kind of a mixed bag, because in some sense, yes, I think everyone's traffic did improve because, people are not going out, people are stuck indoors. So digital traffic did improve. But most people I know within the industry would also respond, but sales or revenue dropped or was severely impacted or disrupted because marketing budgets, advertising, campaigns, events are all frozen or delayed. So it was this mixed bag where externally everyone thinks, oh, this must be great for the media industry, but at the same time it is good in terms of influence and traffic, but it's usually very, very bad for revenue, for monetization, for profitability, which I think kind of reflects the results of their survey. And I think my final point is, at least our experiences, there's still, a huge disconnect between everyone saying they agree that the media industry has huge value to their day-to-day decisions and day-to-day lives. But, the irony is much less percentage actually pay for that. I think our experience is Asia typically might be still a few years behind in terms of that overall mindset, in terms of directly paying or supporting something that you find of value. So if it's still, 3 to 5 years, a little bit behind, but, as a study mentioned, more and more publishers are launching paid membership subscribers. We think maybe, gradually, step by step, just like, the US or Europe, 10 years ago, we will get there in the next 3 to 5 years. So that is something to look forward to.
Indeed, something we all need to look forward to. Now, Ross, let's move on to you now. Were you surprised by these conclusions? And, interesting because you have a slightly different perspective, which is an educator's perspective. Ross, are you there?
Ross, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry, I'm on mute. I have a roaring air conditioner.
We can hear you now.
I have a roaring air conditioner behind me. As an academic, I'm kind of an observer of the business of media. And I'm going to echo a couple of things that have already been said. So Irene introduced, and when she introduced, she talked about the report as being optimistic. And at least in my experience, what you hear from a lot of media operators, media managers, media professionals on the business side is optimism. We know the problems. We are aware of what the problems are, and we are kind of focused on choosing the problems and solving them the best we can. So it's less dire maybe than 4 or 5 years ago when, like Joey, you'd go to a conference and it was kind of doomsday. I think bullish for me always means kind of the Wall Street up and to the right. And I'm not sure the people I talk to see up and to the right. They see a lot of very pressing problems, business models, distribution models, the role of the platforms, the turmoil in the advertising industry. So while we talk about the news industry, the advertising industry is going through similar transition. But the problems are clear, and I think partly because of COVID. We had to focus on them during COVID. The second thing I'd say is something that Byron started with. It's a very comprehensive report. So looking at a region as rich as Asia Pacific, so from Japan and Australia to the markets in ASEAN to Singapore, Malaysia, it's a pretty big bag. So I was impressed with the depth of the questioning, especially on the executive side. I would love to see all the data at some point, but we'll get to that another day. And then the last thing was something that Naka mentioned that Alan Soon had said, and that is these business models are very complex, and understanding each of them, figuring out how they fit with your audience, how they fit with your own market, and being able to manage across all of them in some way, that is what I hear from most of the people. Most of the executives I deal with aren't doing day-to-day subscriptions or advertising work. They're managing teams that do that. And just being able to stay innovative. And the thing they mentioned, which was mentioned in the report, is just the impossibility of finding talent. So finding somebody who understands content, understands technology, and has a sense of sales, if you find them, 9 times out of 10 in 6 months, they're working for a bank anyway. So I was impressed with the detail under the report. And for me, I read the word bullish as optimism. We know the problems now and we're kind of working on them. So.
Yeah, again, some great insights there, Ross, and we'll certainly get into some of those issues you brought up, particularly this need for innovation and the need for technology to help along with that. But let's move back a little bit. Something that the report brought up was the fact that obviously we've all been impacted by the pandemic over the last 2+ years, and this has had a real impact on the news industry. That's something that came across very clearly in this report. So for Joey and Ritu, obviously you were running these businesses as well as managing news desks. So give us a sense of what your journeys were like during the pandemic. Ritu, do you want to start again?
Even before the pandemic broke, several of us have referred to the doomsday feeling there was before the pandemic struck. And I think all of us were beginning to realize that one of the things that we have to start looking at, two things actually. One is cost. And I think we, for instance, were constantly talking about reviewing the costs and where could we, creatively cut down, but we weren't actually moving towards that because there was still some notion that things will, ad revenue will suddenly work out. What the pandemic did for us was to seriously look at costs. For instance, because we let go of one entire floor. So, the real estate shrank, and we realized that didn't make any difference. The other thing we realized is that we've got to move very quickly to agile technology, which was one of the outcomes of the pandemic, because journalists were reporting from wherever they were not coming into the office. We do a lot of video content. So we then looked for really light and agile technology, much more detail, with a far detailed lens on how can we lean on technology to cut costs and yet be more creative in the way we are doing, putting content out there. The third thing that happened, I think, was, and I think that's something that we really need to focus much, much more on. We started looking much more carefully at what people were consuming and what is it that they wanted. I think what became clear was people wanted information that will really help their lives through the pandemic and after. And I think that definitely made us relook at some of the content. For instance, FAQs and explainers became very important for us, and we found that there was a huge, audience for that kind of content. And then, of course, now everyone's trying to figure out what is the ideal now that the pandemic is sort of endemic, and what are the kind of hybrid structures, what is the kind of technology that we really should be focusing on. For instance, in India, compared to, say, the West, technology of transaction for people, for reader revenue, for people to be able to make payments. Now that's so much more glitchy and complicated with layers of OTP, and currently the government is making it, because there's so much of scams in a digital economy, that it's becoming even more and more complex to really make reader revenue become a smooth and easy experience. So I think the two big things. One is looking much more at technology. The other was looking at cost. And the third thing was, if you want to move towards reader revenue from being so dependent on ad revenue, you really needed to know what is it that you have that people will want to pay for, which means you need to look away from all the kind of news that's available on aggregator platforms and on Google, and which is available, so news, the commodity news, or air as it's referred to, and really finally define your value proposition. And I think that's where a lot of us are in the process of moving away from being everything to everyone to being more specifically a unique offering.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ritu. Absolutely, really interesting to hear the kind of challenges that you faced during the pandemic, and of course, you again, the significance and the importance of being agile and adapting to these many challenges. Joey, give us a sense of how you maneuvered through the challenges of the pandemic.
Sure. I think for us, the main theme during the last 3 years, the takeaway was diversification. We were fortunate in that we were starting to diversify from one original news brand to multiple verticals. So we started with serious news, and we started doing some small acquisitions right before the pandemic. So we started diversifying into sports, lifestyle, gadget, movies, etc. The last 2.5 years just accelerated that because we're based in Taipei, and other parts, other Asian cities, once they were going through very strict COVID lockdowns, we realized that all the solely media companies that depended on advertising saw the exact same line going up and down, where whenever there was a lockdown, advertising would drop, campaigns would drop, events or marketing budgets would be delayed. So that also forced us to almost try to complete the puzzle. So I'll give an example. I think in one of the pages on the report, it mentioned, the different business models that everyone wants to try, from, expanding marketing, advertising, to other data services, events, paid membership subscriptions, AI or MarTech, et cetera. I think over the past 2.5 years, we've diversified into almost every one of them. And that was because we realized if we continue acquiring or growing just as a media company, that line will look exactly the same. Only the the lows and highs will get worse and worse, because we're all dependent on advertising. And whenever there's an issue, whenever there's a lockdown, whenever there's another outbreak, the entire company will suffer more, because we're 90% dependent on one revenue stream. So then the game kind of becomes, then how do we look for other partners? How do we look for the next acquisition target that is 90% subscriptions, 90% e-commerce, 90% MarTech, AdTech, or data exchanges. So we're trying to kind of flatten the line, so it's not such a high and low like a wave by wave, but instead it looks like a very flat line, because whenever advertising is affected, for example, maybe data exchanges or maybe agency communications is actually at a high point. So they kind of even each other out. So I think the main idea that we had over the past 2.5 years was to echo one of the pages in the report. I firmly believe by now that media companies of the future, not only will technology be an important pillar, but I would say they have to be even 50% technology companies, because you need the technology part of the business to diversify your revenue. So it's not just the media part of the business. We need to, again, flatten out the line, and that is dependent on other technology services to roll out new products like MarTech, like AdTech, like big data, like AI CDPs. How do we generate other revenues outside of media that kind of surrounds, protects, but also supplements media in terms of monetizing the data that we're collecting? Of course, all GDPR and privacy law compliant, but it helps to make the revenue, make the profits that allows us to protect and reinvest in better quality journalism. So it creates that positive cycle, that positive loop. The final point I will add is, I think in the past 2.5 years, because of COVID and because of the pandemic, it is interestingly a good moment to do consolidation. A lot of smaller verticals, a lot of smaller companies are facing the exact same challenges. Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, one market can sustain 10 different media verticals or 10 different related companies. But because of all this drama of lockdowns going in and out, the market is shrinking. So maybe the market now can only sustain 5 related media companies. Then it is a good opportunity to all consolidate together, so everyone survives together in the long term. I think that's our main takeaway.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Joey. Really fascinating developments that you've outlined there. And I'm hearing very similar things between you and what Ritu said. You called it diversification and the need to keep up with innovation, the need to keep up with businesses. Ritu called it agility, the need to be agile. Now, Ross, I'm also keen to hear your perspective as an academic, as somebody from kind of watching the industry evolve with all of these challenges that it faces, obviously keeping up the business side of things, as well as maintaining the integrity of the news side of things. How do news organizations maintain this balance? Ross, I believe you're on mute again.
Again, I'm so sorry. I have a roaring antique air conditioner behind me. It's a big question. How do you maintain this agility? How do you maintain the balance? I think some of it is what Joey mentions, it's scale. You have to kind of, you can almost think about media in any world, but I think in Asia in particular, you have startups, you have lots of innovation, entrepreneurial, very much like the Quint and the Newslands 5 or 6, or I can't remember your actually starting dates, you two, but you have people that continue to do that. And then just finding the people who have the right mix of talent, the right sense of audience, the right set of internal processes, and the right content sense that they can kind of build, because it does require scale to be agile, right? So if Joey makes a decision, or I'm sorry, I'm using you guys as examples, but if an executive makes a decision and it fails, and if you're too small, you run the risk of kind of corporate suicide, right? So there is some benefit there's a lot of benefit on the business side to scale, whether it's data scale, operation scale, the ability to hire talent, and just the ability to innovate, right? So you can, I'll use the example of some of the guys in Jakarta, so the Tempo team, they're constantly looking at new ways of telling stories. So if you look at the business, I kind of look at the businesses in three pieces: the content, how content is evolving for all these platforms, the distribution, all of these platforms, and then the revenue, where does the money come to support that? And you're kind of looking for people who can innovate on all three, and that is a huge task. And so one of the ways to do it is scale. Another is investment. And I would say one of the things that I worry about is there's not a lot of money going. So if you're a large corporate, right? If you are the Asahi or you're the Nikkei, there's not a lot of large funds that focus on media that are Asia-based. So there are some global funds that may have Asia investments here and there. I can probably think of 5, and most of the 5 aren't exclusively media. So having the resources to do this is another piece. So being able to find those. And then the other way of balancing this is, for me, is going to be people. And again, I come back to something I think Ritu mentioned it in one of her quotes in the report, is finding people that are willing to, it's a pretty turbulent world where the upside, the individual upside is not the same as, say, working on an AI product, right? So finding those people that are committed to the journalistic values, the news values, the storytelling values, that are also smart enough to do the AI work or the blockchain work, or whatever your technology platform is, it's hard. And you need those people, and you need that commitment, because 1 out of 5 of the experiments will fail. So, sorry, kind of a rambling answer, but.
No, it is really crucial. And in fact, some of your comments have already spurred some questions along those lines, which we will get to at some point. But really crucial, again, thanks for all the questions that are coming in. We will get to them because they are fascinating, so keep them coming. One of the questions, in fact, very early on, touches on this whole notion of fake news. Okay, we're all dealing with it. Everyone has to grapple with it. It's eroded, as the question suggests, eroded the role of the media in the long term, or it has the potential of doing that. So what we've noticed, obviously, is social media absolutely amplifies the distribution of fake news and misinformation. So how can news outlets drive positive change? It's a real challenge, isn't it? Ritu or Joey, either one of you can talk about this and how you're dealing with it.
Sure, I guess I'll go first this time. So I think the short answer is probably there's a more passive defensive angle and a more aggressive taking the initiative angle. So of course, just like most media organizations, one section of our reporting might be devoted to debunking or scientifically or objectively providing all the facts to kind of counterpoint or explain why the recent misinformation this week that everyone is discussing is wrong as rationally and fair as possible. So that's more on the reactionary end. I would think from a strategic, big picture, long-term end for publishers or media companies, eventually I think the answer is to simply be at an arm's length and less dependent on third-party social media platforms. As in, we need to diversify. We can of course put our content on Facebook, on Instagram, or Line, or or whatever is the social media in each market. It's fine to use them, but understand that at the end they're third party. They could at a whim change their algorithm. They're not dependable. Their intention is not, or the original DNA is not media. They're not journalists. Their intention is to have more and more users on their platform. So we can use them to a certain extent to get our influence or our brand out there. But in the long term, we must make sure, we must try to have all of our readers, our supporters, our consumers come directly to our own website via either our own app, our own newsletter, our own paid subscriptions, memberships. So it's very important that if we compare to 5 years ago, let's say 80% of all of our readers were finding us through social media. So are we comparing that to right now, where let's say only 20% is coming to us through social media or discovering us through social media? But once they discover us, we're able to transition them to a steady, regular user that comes directly to one of our directly owned assets. And once we have that relationship, then of course it makes it much easier for us to provide the valuable content that we are creating and not be dependent on someone else's third-party feed that of course is easily influenced by whatever fake news or misinformation is going on that week. So I think for all publishers or media companies involved, the only long-term thing that we can do that's truly in our control and within our benefit is to establish a direct bridge, a direct first-party relationship with our readers, gain their trust, create better content, create that positive cycle, and not rely on third-party platforms. Every 3 to 5 years, there will be a new third-party platform that seemingly is the new savior. I remember, for example, in this part of the region, 3-4 years ago, when Facebook was changing its algorithm crazily, a lot of people were saying then we should, decrease our influence on Facebook and maybe transition everything to Line. And once Line became the fastest growing platform, they started pumping prices, increasing prices like crazy, like 10, 20, 50x overnight. And then, 2 years ago, the conversation became, oh, now Line has all the power. Do we want to diversify to Instagram or Telegram or whatnot? It will become that vicious cycle that repeats itself every 3 to 5 years, unless we fully recognize and acknowledge that we have to take back control. That's the only way that we will gradually solve this problem in the long term.
Ritu, your thoughts? Yeah, how do we take back control?
I think there's really, I completely agree with Joey that eventually, for various reasons, including tackling misinformation, you need to get your audiences onto your owned and operated platform. But having said that, I think there has to be an interim period, because you have to be able to be in the same spaces where the misinformation, disinformation, malinformation is spreading. And so I don't think this is currently, from a social responsibility of news point of view, I don't think this is the time to vacate the social media, WhatsApp and other messenger platforms, because there is the misinformation right now is so polarizing and so dangerous that because we are also fact checkers at the Quint, that we feel that it's really important to not vacate the social media space right now, to put out as much of the fact check content in as innovative formats that Ross referred to, so that the fact check content is as viral as the misinformation, because that's the only way you can tackle it. Because if you just stay, if you vacate the social media space or the big tech platforms right now, you may just give a free play to more misinformation to spread. So I think what you need to do, and you've got to be, so now if consumer behavior, if TikTok has come and changed consumer behavior to short format and video format and the Reels format, then I think your fact check content has to be as attractive on these platforms to combat that. And I feel that's where you build your trust with the audience, because that's the trust deficit is another huge elephant in the room, right? The trust deficit of the audience in news. So you use your fact checking and your quality journalism to be out there and to constantly build trust and a relationship with the audience. And then you somehow use that to bring the audience to your owned and operated site. And we're at the Quint, we're seeing that happen. Exactly to your point, Joey, when we started off, we were just a Facebook page, for instance, 6-7 years ago. And we wouldn't have grown, we wouldn't have been able to build our brand if we didn't have the distribution that social media gave us. But we've come down from 80% of our traffic being on social media to it being 15 to 20% of our total traffic. But like I'm saying, I don't think this is a time to vacate social media. Or in India, it's WhatsApp, which is, it's referred to as WhatsApp University, which is where people go for all their learning, which is really, a lot of it is misinformation. And the other thing that I think collectively the news industry needs to do is engage in media literacy, is making audiences aware of how to distinguish fact from fake. So I think we really have to go beyond our conventional roles as journalists or news media because of the landscape being what it is.
Yeah, no, some great points, Ritu and Joey. And in fact, Ross, I want to bring you into that as well. This need for media literacy as an academic. I'm sure that's something that comes up a lot. But let me just go to a next question, which relates to what you've just both talked about, because, it is a real challenge. And the question asks, how do media companies balance monetizing with their duty to present factual information to the masses? Putting important verified information behind paywalls limits the reach and leaves an information gap that invariably gets filled by less credible sources. So, some of that social media that we've been talking about. I know you've anticipated this question to some degree, but Ross, let's bring you in here. And, how can this be done? Because obviously, watching from the outside, educating students and people about this industry, it's a real crucial thing, isn't it?
Yeah, so educating students, educating adults, educating everybody about, the prevalence of fake news. I did a little research recently in Bangladesh where we were looking specifically at this question. And I think we underestimate how literate people are. Especially people that are faced with a complicated media environment, an environment of different levels of control and censorship. People are quite sophisticated in how they use different things. So I think one of the challenges, and it kind of gets to the question that the person just asked, that you were just quoting, Sharanjit, and that is the assumption that if I put out the truth, everybody's going to find it is wrong, right? People tend to gravitate to things that they tend to believe, that they want to believe. And I guess if I were to be, as an observer, a critic of the news industry, the journalism profession, is we tend to have a lot of confidence that if I tell the truth, everybody's going to believe it. And I think where we fail, where the industry fails, is not understanding the emotional inclination that people have to believe what they want to believe. And finding ways, Ritu mentioned it, finding ways to tell the story in a different way, presenting it in a different way. Sometimes it means presenting it in a way that's more emotional or more fun or more playful, that isn't always in the DNA of a traditional newsroom. So it's very easy if you come from a journalistic background, and I've worked in the news business for 40 odd years, it's very easy to believe the truth is quality. That isn't necessarily what the audience believes. The audience believes the truth is what I want it to be in often cases. And it's an unfortunate realization that I find sometimes people whose business is telling the truth and the facts, they don't really appreciate it. I don't want to hear that fact. So I don't have a good answer for this, but I do find when you talk to people about, I'll give you an example. We did some focus groups in Bangladesh and we showed people two stories. They were the exact same story. One under the brand of a major local newspaper, and one that same story being shared on a WhatsApp group. The tendency to believe the original branded story, the story on the website, was very high. The same story on a WhatsApp group was very low. So a lot of people's trust is kind of telegraphed to the platform, and being able to understand all of this. It's a complicated calculus that I would say but it's more than just truth is right and truth is what quality is and that is what people want. I just don't see any behavioral information that suggests that's true. And I wish I could say otherwise, but that's not what I experience as an academic. So sorry, a bit of a contrarian view there.
But again, so fascinating to hear those insights, and particularly some of those studies that you've done in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Now, as you say, it is so complicated. And here's another question about all the different platforms out there. So question asked, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on multi-platform. What do you see as the return on investment in putting out supplementary content on Instagram stories, TikTok, Twitter spaces, and the like? And is that changing, as Ritu noted, 2022 as a somewhat pandemic agnostic year where news in all its forms faces more competition in the attention economy? So great question there. Some really great questions coming in. Who'd like to take this one?
Sure, I guess I'll start first.
Go ahead, Joey. Thanks.
So just to kind of clarify, using the previous example, I did not mean to completely, cut off all social media. I think what we've seen is whenever we launch a new brand, during the initial, first 2 years, for example, when no one knows your brand, when you need to get the brand out there, when you need to generate eyeballs, then by all means, we still put all of our content on a Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or whatnot. So initially, I think social media is still very effective to get your brand out there when no one knows who you are. But my point, my former point being, but it's dangerous if 5 or 10 years down the road, for that same brand, it's still 80% coming from social media. That means over 5 years, we failed to establish a direct relationship with our readers, which will allow us to safely kind of diversify away from other third-party controlled platforms and kind of control our own fates in terms of influence, direct trust with our readers, and also monetization. So my short answer to the question would be, initially, when we have no leverage, when we have no brand equity, when we have no power or trust with our readers, of course, social media is there. We still need social media. It's impossible to completely cut off social media. But I think the overarching plan should be keep it at an arm's distance in that same love-hate relationship where they need us for content, we need them for eyeballs initially, but understand that that relationship will not be the same forever. We need to gradually diversify away and take control into our own hands. So I think our overarching policy is we're open and we use different social media for different verticals. So for example, serious news might work better on Facebook or Twitter. Lifestyle news might work better on Instagram or YouTube. So it's definitely not one social media policy for one different publisher. It's all customized. There might be one vertical that has no Facebook, but it's all Instagram or vice versa. But no matter what, the long-term idea is we should see a healthy, gradual decrease. Just like Ritu mentioned, to be honest, those numbers were exactly the same as ours. When we started, 80% of all of our traffic came from Facebook or social media. After 5 years, it dropped to about 20 to 30%. And that ideally is a healthy metric to see over the long term.
And Ritu, what's your sense of this need for multi-platform and the challenges that this poses?
I wish I could say that we can lean less and less on social media. But for instance, India stats, for instance, show that a large chunk of consumption is actually video. And the kind of tech that, say, YouTube has to draw audiences to video, it's very, very difficult for newsrooms like us to have that tech. So I think there is, to get the audiences to not consume our video reports on YouTube and to consume them only on our site. So I really think we need to focus on tech and innovation. I don't have quick and easy answers on how to do that, because Unfortunately, it's not just as simple as putting quality content and not sharing it on social media and expecting audiences to come there. I think you need to do, I mean, sometimes the kind of thing that we experiment with is that we put the teaser out there on social media and try and draw audiences to consume the main content on our site. But that's a bit of a hit and trial. It works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't work. So I think that's work in progress. And I think there has to be a working relationship with the big platforms, with the big tech, to work in partnership with them, because I don't think you can just wish them away. They've had such a lead on the technology of digital on all of us, while all of us continue to focus only on content. They focus on technology. And there is such a deep relationship between technology and audience traffic, fortunately or unfortunately. So I think it's work in progress. And I think we have to constantly keep our eyes on innovation to make that happen, and to keep looking for, like I said, keep looking for what is the audience need that is not being fulfilled, that you are fulfilling, which will drive audiences to your site. Because if you're constantly doing everything that everybody else is doing, that's not going to help.
Yeah, and again, you really, really do underscore the complicated nature of the business and how tough it is to make those decisions that you all have to make. Now, we've just got a few more minutes left in this session, but I do want to get to some of these really great questions that you've been asking. So thank you for those Q&As. Here's a question for Ross, and Ross, really fascinating. You've talked about the need to educate and this need for talent. So this question asks, where does education come in strengthening the news industry? You talked about finding talent. How does the industry address this as a whole? Again, a huge question. Ross, would you like to take this one?
Sure. So again, I'm an educator and at an educational institution where we train journalists, both undergrads and graduate students. As an industry, one of the things that I find has kind of gone dormant, although I'm starting to see new embers of it. At one point in time, there was a lot of energy between journalists and technologists. Some of you may remember, may have even attended hacks and hackers meetings in Taipei or in Delhi. But if somebody can tell me when there's a hacks and hackers meeting any place between, say, Mumbai and Tokyo in the next year, I'd be shocked. So that energy, that almost spontaneous energy of coming together to solve a problem, a lot of that was supported by big newsrooms. So one of the things that newsrooms can do is to realize that it's not all about them, it's about the industry, and to find ways to either bring journalists. So a typical journalism management program will often have you go through different desks in the newsroom. I cannot name one of a major news organization in Asia that actually has you sit in advertising or work on metrics or work in the subscription business. So for journalists to understand how content is changing, they need to understand how the platforms demand the change. They need to understand the metrics that are driving some of the change, and they need to understand the revenue pieces of that. So some of that can be internal training programs. Some of that can be supporting young people getting together to try to solve the problems on their own. And I'd say, recently as part of the pandemic, I think there's been a lot of activities, a lot of it is in Taipei or in Tokyo, around not playing, that's a little dismissive, but experimenting with some of the more rarefied elements of blockchain as solutions to either revenue problems, monetizing the archive. And those are all often spontaneous. They just happen to be together in a Starbucks or and finding ways to encourage that. For academic institutions, we have a program here around entrepreneurship, and it's really just a business 101, assuming that most journalists aren't going to go to the New York Times where they can be journalists purely. And so it's always good to know where your salary comes from. And so understanding the basics of advertising, understanding the basics of subscriptions, and membership programs, understanding the basics of technology and kind of product management decisions. Not that we train full product managers, but at least people know what a product manager is when they get to a newsroom. But for me, it is really just, there is an energy between content and product and business, and finding ways to encourage that. And some people would be critical that that kind of breaks down church and state, but part of the reason we are often so reliant on the platforms is that is the venue where church and state broke down, right? So they've solved things that we didn't solve because we never got together to solve them. Whether it's user behavior on a social network, or how content is shared, or how metrics is generated. Those are things we all could have done. We just needed to have the right people in the room to do it. So.
Yeah, no, really fascinating insights, Ross. And I could see Joey and Ritu listening intently, probably taking down notes, thinking this is really great advice for us to be able to obviously grow and expand our businesses. We are running out of time, though, and there's another great question about media literacy, but I think to some extent that has been answered. I just wanted to end the session with some quick thoughts from all three of you, and you've all been fascinating, and Byron and some of the others who spoke to us earlier. Naka, please jump in if you want to. This is a session, it's a report we've been talking about the sustainability of news. So my question to all of you is, do you think news can be sustained? And how do you see the industry evolving, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, in the next 5 years? If you were all going to look into the future and you had one prediction to make, and do make it a short prediction because we are running out of time, what would it be? So who would like to kick off with this?
Okay,
I think I'm going to go to Joey.
Yeah,
Thank you, Joey.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
So yeah, short answer. I think kind of, again, going back to that balance example, I think there will be a lot of geopolitical pressure in Asia, a lot of tension, but at the same time, that will create a lot of more demand. As it always does. So it will be a hard time, it will be a challenging time, but it will also be an exciting time. And again, I personally believe that all media companies, digital media companies of the future, 50% of them will have to be a technology company. Going back to what Ross mentioned, it's impossible for us going in the foreseeable future where we're just journalists. We create the content, but we have to understand the distribution, we have to understand the product, we have to understand the monetization as well. So it's going to become much more challenging, but at the same time, I guess also much more diverse and much more exciting in the sense that we're going to all be, I guess, journalists or specialists across all the technology, data, services, and content fields.
Thank you, Joey. Anyone else want to jump in on what the future of news and news sustainability will look like in 5 years? Yeah, Ross, go ahead. I think you're on mute, Ross.
Roaring air conditioner. I'm so sorry. So I'll keep it short. I'm actually really encouraged by some of the longer form storytelling. So a lot of the elements of the news industry are because of the nature of news content. It's very short, it's very fast, and it has what we call in academics a very short half-life. So the value of a story today may be whatever advertising you generated. The value for the story 5 days from now is zero, generally, right? Somebody's rewritten the story, something else has happened. And so there is a fundamental problem in kind of the breaking high velocity news coverage. And it's high cost often to do. But I am encouraged looking at things that are, for lack of a better word, slower, longer, higher cost, higher investment, long form documentary. People, so for instance, in the mainland, we have young people that are telling long stories, either in short live items or in long Douyin TikTok, but they're serialized. So I'm really encouraged by people, especially young people's embrace of these new platforms to tell significant stories, not just cat videos or cooking videos. People are doing that and finding ways to monetize them, archive them, make money on them on a long-term basis. News itself, I think, will continue. I fully subscribe to Joey's. I think the demand for news from the region will skyrocket in the next, if it hasn't already started, in the next year or two. So, but I am encouraged by the long form.
Excellent. Well, that's great to hear. Ritu, do you want to have a sense of what's going to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting that I heard Ross say what he did, because we actually do about 12 to 15 deep dive immersive documentaries a year. But what we are finding is that we're actually pivoting away from doing documentaries, which are 15 to 20 to half an hour long, to actually serializing the same content into 5-minute shots, because we're finding that people are not staying long enough and not consuming. And we feel that a very critical part of our research or our investigation does not get consumed. So we're actually, as we speak, moving to the other side. So I think the future is going to be far more visual. I think consumer behavior, consumer format behavior will be dictated a bit by big platforms or by social media, but news will have to adapt to that. And like I said, I think you'll have to work very closely with technology to be able to eventually get audiences to your site. And I can't underline that. I think there has to be so much more unique ground reporting, getting the stories that nobody else is getting. I can't seem to underline, because that's where we find our audiences coming to us. So I think it's going to be visual. I think it's going to be shorter, in contrarian to what Ross had to say. And I think it'll have to be, you'll have to work I think it'll have to be a participative process with audiences, rather than we are, truth holders. We'll have to become truth seekers in partnership with audiences.
Thank you for that, Ritu. Again, great insights from our panelists. And I did want to just perhaps leave it with the last word from one of the others, Naka or Byron or Irene. What are your thoughts on where you think the news industry is going to be headed in 5 years? Just a really quick 10-second summation.
10 seconds is pretty tight, but I'll share very quickly that yeah, I think 2 data points that stuck out to me from the report that were very heartening to me are, again, that 82% of consumers believe that news is essential to a functioning society, and that 76% of consumers were really worried about misinformation. That's higher than I thought. So normal people value news. Normal people are very aware of the problem of misinformation. And so that gives me hope for the future of news in this region. And I personally do believe that we may be at the peak of the influence of big tech companies on news. Regulation is happening across the world, starting in the US and in Europe. Also, user habits are changing. We saw a decrease in people spending time in user numbers on Facebook, most notably in the US. And, Joey, you talked about Asia sometimes being 3 to 5 years behind the US and the West in terms of some internet trends. So my hope and belief is that the market power of these big tech platforms will decrease because it's at a peak, and that will be to the benefit of the media industry.
Okay. Naka, go ahead.
Yes, no, just 5 seconds for me. Thank you, everyone. And for me, I cannot really address where the industry will be headed in 5 years, but some of the interesting stories I heard in the course of conducting the interviews is that, to catch the big wave of change, you really have to be aware of the small changes that are happening. These could be very small changes that don't even get picked up. And so what I'm trying to say is that we all know that technology is going to be a key component of the industry going forward. And also the fact that, we don't all need to be engineers to be implementing these changes. I think, journalists or anybody who's working for the media industry need to realize that, how do we start thinking fully digitally to make this pivot fully that has been, accelerated during the pandemic? And anybody could be thinking that way. And we don't all need to be engineers, but we can start making changes from any level, really. So that was just a comment from me.
Thank you, Naka. And I think at this point, it does look like we are completely out of time. But I just wanted to thank all our panelists once again. Of course, the introduction to the report, diving deep into this new report about new sustainability, investing in the future of Asia Pacific's info ecosystem, something we all need to think about. Do go back and have a look at this report. It is really fascinating with some of the insights, the statistics mentioned, really some surprising data, but it's truly shedding a light on what's going on in this news industry. And again, so fascinating to hear from our panelists about the struggles, the challenges, the optimism, the hope for growth in the next 5 years for the industry as well. And again, a huge thank you to all of you watching. Some really great questions that you've been asking. We really appreciate you joining us and taking the time today. So thanks once again. And that brings us to an end of this session. Hopefully you'll all have very constructive weeks ahead.